Welcome to this explainer. Today we're cracking open a really fascinating case file. We are looking at a deeply intriguing thesis proposed by Reverend C.H. King and Dr. Ethel R. Nelson in their book, The Discovery of Genesis. They put forward a striking proposition that the narrative of the book of Genesis, the biblical story of beginnings, is actually hidden inside the very structure of ancient Chinese characters. We're going to explore exactly how they built this argument, treating their linguistic analysis as a framework for an ancient mystery.
Okay, let's dive right into our agenda. First, a linguistic mystery. Second, dissecting the characters. Third, the case of boat. Fourth, the case of to create. Fifth, the ancient monotheistic timeline. And finally, number 6, coincidence or intelligent synthesis.
Section 1, a linguistic mystery, hidden in plain sight. So this is the foundational question of our explainer. Kang and Nelson noticed these astonishing similarities between the Chinese language and the early chapters of Genesis. Stuff like the creation of man, the garden, the fall, the flood. So what if these ancient historical memories weren't lost to the East, but were actually encoded right into their written language? Like the foreword of the book states, there is a genuine kinship between a good detective story and this volume. The authors are essentially acting as linguistic archaeologists. They aren't relying on newly dug up pottery or buried ruins. Instead, their evidence is literally made up of the tiny drawings and strokes that have been preserved in plain sight for thousands of years in the Chinese script. Moving right along to Section 2, dissecting the characters, the anatomy of ideograms. Now, the Chinese written language is fundamentally different from phonetic alphabets like English. It's based on ideograms. Ideograms are essentially ancient picture writings, and the author's entire thesis rests on the fact that complex Chinese characters can be broken down into simpler constituent parts, which are known as radicals. By isolating these individual symbols, the authors argue we can uncover the original embedded meaning, literally the ideas behind the grams. Which brings us to Section 3, the case of boat. Evidence in the strokes. Now, take a really close look at the ancient calligraphy right here. You're looking at the traditional Chinese character for boat. At first glance, sure, it just looks like a unified symbol. But Pastor Kang realized that this character is not just some random collection of lines. It's actually a composite of 3 very distinct, separate symbols brought together to form a single concept. Let's break this down exactly the way the authors did. First, on the left side of the character, we have the radical that means vessel. Second, up on the top right, we have the radical for the number 8. And third, situated right below the 8, we have the radical for mouth. And in this context, mouth is widely understood to represent a person, kind of like how we say we have 8 mouths to feed. So a boat is literally defined in this ancient language as a vessel containing 8 people. The authors point out a really striking parallel here. According to the Genesis narrative, the first great boat of historical significance, Noah's Ark, carried exactly 8 passengers. That's Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives. A vessel, 8 people. For Kang and Nelson, there is just no way this is mere happenstance. They argue this specific character was intentionally constructed to preserve the memory of the Great Flood. All right, Section 4, the case of to create. Forming life. Here we have the calligraphy for the word to create. The text notes that Pastor Kang actually first had this massive revelation about Chinese characters while working in a mission hospital. He was analyzing this exact character when he was just absolutely astonished by what its individual components revealed. So let's deconstruct this one too. The character for create consists of 3 distinct radicals. First, there's the symbol for dust or mud. Second, there's the symbol for mouth. And third, over on the left side, there's a sweeping downward stroke that indicates walking, movement, or life. Dust, a mouth, and movement. And this is where the author's central thesis really comes to life, especially when you lay it right next to Genesis 2:7. The biblical text reads, "The Lord God formed man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being." The authors argue that the Chinese character for to create is quite literally a visual depiction of this exact verse, God taking dust, using his mouth to breathe into it, and bringing about a living, moving being. It's an absolutely stunning visual correlation. Section 5, the ancient monotheistic timeline, establishing motive. Now, you might be wondering, how does the timeline actually match up? Well, the authors address this by mapping it out. They align the approximate origin of the written Chinese language, which is around 2500 BC, with the date calculated for the biblical dispersion of races from the Tower of Babel. According to their argument, the migrating people who settled China brought these shared historical memories with them and then encoded them into their new writing system. Furthermore, they note that polytheistic religions, things like Taoism and Buddhism, didn't even enter Chinese culture until around 500 BC. That is a full 2,000 years later.
This chronological gap is absolutely crucial because the authors point out that the original religion of the ancient Chinese was strictly monotheistic. They had no idols, no complex mythology. Instead, they worshipped a single supreme ruler of heaven. The authors argue that this original monotheistic culture is the true source of these characters, forming a perfect parallel with the worldview found in the early chapters of Genesis. Finally, Section 6, Coincidence or Intelligence Synthesis, Weighing the Verdict.
The authors essentially contrast two possible explanations for these wild linguistic parallels. On one hand, you have the traditional theory that language origins and character formation just happened or just evolved over time through natural, unguided processes. But on the other hand, Kang and Nelson propose what they call intelligent synthesis. This is the idea that the ancient Chinese deliberately, painstakingly engineered these characters to immortalize their historical and theological origins. So we have to ask the question they pose to their readers. Could so many meaningful ideograms really just happen? Could they just evolve without intelligent synthesis? When you consider the mathematical probability of characters like boat and to create aligning so perfectly with these ancient texts, well, it certainly challenges natural skepticism. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep seeking out the fascinating structures hidden in the information all around us.